Welcome to the Executive Coach Podcast with me, Maya Goodker, and today is a real special episode for me. I'm joined by somebody who has shaped how I think about work, parenting, planning, and honestly, how I've built my life, especially since having kids. Sarah Hart-Unger is going to join us today, and she's been one of my absolute gurus in the podcast space. You could even argue she's one of the reasons why I'm here podcasting at all. Sarah and Laura Vanderkam's podcast, Best of Both Worlds, was the first podcast that I ever regularly started listening to right after my son was born. And really, it became my Bible for navigating family and work and hobbies. And over the years, I have also listened to Sarah's other podcast, Best Laid Plans, which is closely linked to the book that she is now launching. Sarah is known for her legendary planning expertise. And what I love about her approach is that it's not cold, rigid, or performative. It's intentionally building in the things that we are passionate about and that we care about into our lives. And it's done from a place of kindness and enthusiasm for living our lives, rather than from a place of fear or pressure or the need to meet some sort of external ideal. So in today's episode, we will dive into exactly how she does that, her tools, and therefore the life that she's built as a result. I get to ask her all the things that I've always wanted to ask her. I've read her blog religiously, and I have just loved all kinds of recommendations from her food bowls to her fiction recommendations. You will get a really clear window into Sarah's planning system, but even more than that, I think you'll get a sense of the energy behind that and why it works, and why planning doesn't need to mean rigid standards, or it doesn't need to be boring. It can be really fun and it can create so much joy and alignment. So I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. Let's dive in. So Sarah, welcome to the Executive Coach Podcast. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on.
I am so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm going to dive into the questions that I have for you, because I've been dreaming up my questions for you for a long time because I've listened to so much of your stuff. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you is that, having followed your work for a long time, you are in many things, right? You are a physician, or as we say in the UK, a doctor, mother of 3, podcaster, but with 2 podcasts, blogger, and now you have a book out. So that is so many things. And then you have all the usual life things, which you've been really open about, sharing like health challenges recently, and then also your various family members and their challenges. What enables you to do so much without tipping over? And do you ever just go, I just want a year off?
Maybe. No, I would say, well, the first thing is that I'm never doing all of these things at once. I am such a compartmentalizer, and I didn't set out to grow my kind of podcast and creative role until I had decided to go part-time at work. My podcast did exist in a space before that, but they were very much corralled into like a half day or a day I had off. And it was like the amount of time I had was the amount of time I had. And it wasn't until I decided I'm going 60% time at work so that I wasn't going to be doing anything clinical in at least 2 weekdays a week that I could dream of doing the rest of this. Because it's true, once you are, have multiple podcasts going, and certainly writing the book, I needed that extra time. And I'm always keenly aware of how I'm spending my time and kind of know what fits and what doesn't. As for the rest, for the most part, my work hours are fairly normal business hours. I'm lucky enough to be in a field, pediatric endocrinology, that's mostly outpatient. And I'm in a larger group, so that when I do have to take call and see patients after hours or answer phone calls after hours, it's very limited slots of the year, during which I can very much consciously kind of dial down everything else without it being too much of a loss, because again, it's only 6 weeks of a year. So I think when you say it all, it sounds like a lot, but I actually don't think I work any more than, most people who have a standard corporate role or a stay-at-home mom. Honestly, that's a harder job, because that one you really never get a break from. It's just that I have started to do a lot of different things. And I think the thing that's enabled me to do that is a really specific awareness of my time and a lot of really robust planning rituals, which again kind of feeds very well into the things I'm passionate about and speak about so much on the podcast.
Yeah. And I think that is what makes so much sense. So the fact that you do manage to do all of this is the perfect almost advert for the planning that you recommend, right? I still just wonder whether you would ever fancy a sabbatical or something. That's what I would love for you sometimes.
So I do think about it. The hard part is, honestly, it would be sort of tempting to take time off clinically, but My profession is very longitudinal. I mean, I have patients that I followed for many years, and it's not the easiest thing to get away, even for a few months at a time. And my creative work, I just love it so much that it's hard to want to step down. However, I have decided like I'm not going to be starting a new book in 2026. So things do ebb and flow. I have
Mm.
made conscious decisions to pull back from certain things. Like I think the first year I started teaching planning courses, I think I did 3 in 1 year, 3 rounds of Best Laid Plans Academy. Oh my gosh, I didn't do any in 2025. So again, like I'm doing a lot, but I'm not doing a lot all at the same
Yeah.
time. I'm choosing what to emphasize and when. And then you did mention my health challenges, but I've been so lucky to after the first couple of months, I have a health issue, but it's not one that like affects my day-to-day energy very much. So I'm very lucky and sympathetic to those where it is impacted because I did experience that for a short time. And my goodness, there are just times in your life you have to dial everything down. But I think when you have robust systems, you can like consciously take a break, figure out exactly where you are, and then rev back up when you're ready to do so.
Yeah. On the kind of energy spectrum, though, I would say from what I've understood of what you do sit quite high because even when you were blogging about dialing it down, you were still recording podcasts in person with Laura, like within a weekend. So I think sometimes do you think we have to acknowledge different energy levels that people have? Have you been ever described as super high energy?
I think most people would describe me as pretty high energy, but
Yeah.
I'm also you mentioned the podcast that I like record right after being hospitalized. I am not a perfectionist. So I think if I held myself to like a very high bar and was like, I have to be 100% and everything in this podcast has got to be, revelational. That's probably not even a word. See, not perfectionist. I might not have done one, but I believe that I'd rather do something, especially if I'm feeling up to it, than do nothing, and so that's kind of been my modus operandi. So, I think that's also part of it. I
I
I
think
do think I probably have on the spectrum maybe a good energy level, we'll say.
But that is actually a really important extra point, and I think one that will be really interesting to listeners, which is that you're not a perfectionist. I think that can actually be well, we know that can be a limiting factor, and when you're having to churn things out on a weekly basis and you have deadlines, that is where not being a perfectionist is extremely helpful. So as well as being a planner, I do think not being a perfectionist is very important. And I've always talked about that for myself, that it can appear to others sometimes when you do lots of things, or you do some things well, people assume that about you as well. The amount of times I have been told that I am one, and actually I find it funny because it's the opposite, and you have to be able to let things go if you've got the big picture and the lots of things that you want to do.
Yes, I totally agree, and I do think sometimes it's people's instinct, "Oh, you write with that cute handwriting and you love to plan everything out and you identify as an upholder on Gretchen Rubin's tendencies, you must be a perfectionist," and I'm like, "Absolutely not." So,
I
and I
think
do
that's
think in some ways it's a powerful, combination. Yeah.
and I think that's some of your appeal and why a lot of us really enjoy following along with your work and your blogs and things. Okay, so I also wanted to ask you about your morning routine. I've always been in awe of it because you've always woken up really early. I've had phases. So during COVID, doing a master's, when there was an impetus, I have, managed to wake up early. But, you know, to me, that is an underpinning of a lot of then what you do, because it sets so much of the rest of your day up for success. Again, do you just want to have a week sometimes where you say, nah, not, I just want to have a lion this week?
Totally, and you know what? I'm allowed to do that, and, like, on occasion, maybe I will, or certainly, like, on vacation with my family, I tend to not wanna get up early and not pack in a lot of things, and I don't do my planning rituals. For the most part, though, I get up early not because I think it's, like, what you're supposed to do or because I'm trying to win anything, but because I actually am a morning person and enjoy the things I do in the morning, so it's very self-serving. I don't think I'd be doing it just out of some sort of, like, "Oh, this is I'm sticking to this disciplined regimen." I happen to really not do well at night. I fall asleep early. I always have. I remember when I was a kid, like, we'd be staying up and watching TV or even in college when everyone skews late, I would happily, like, fall asleep on my top bunk bed while my roommate, who is this total night owl, and I'm still such close friends with her, she's an artist, now she's a graphic designer, and she'd be, like, with her art friends on our floor, like, painting I don't even know what they were doing, like, arty things late into the night, and I'm, like, happily sleeping and then get up for my 8 a.m. class. So I'm, like, just kind of skewed that
Wired.
way. I would
Yeah.
say the only thing that I feel like really, really I would love people to consider is to do some kind of planning ritual for each day. That doesn't have to be in the morning if you're a night person. Do it before you go to bed if that's how your mind operates. But for many people, including myself, I love for the very first thing I do to be to get out my planner, figure out exactly kind of what's on the docket for the day, look at my week's tasks, and decide what I'd like that day to look like. And in an ideal world, what I'd like to fit in. So that is one part of my morning routine. I feel better when I do it. I do take breaks on it from time to time, and I believe my system is very forgiving in that way. I mean, there's nothing to say. You can just be like, "I'm not planning this week. I will resume on Monday," or whatever it is. But for the most part, I really enjoy getting it in, so I do it.
Okay, and just for listeners who aren't as familiar with Sarah Hart-Unger's work, you typically wake up like 6
5-ish.
a.m.
Yeah,
Yeah,
5-ish.
5ish, and
Because
that
I
hasn't
usually have
changed.
to drive my husband and I have a complicated system, but 3 days a week, I'm driving my kids to school, which means leaving at 7:30, and usually the other 2 days, I'm going to Pilates fairly early, so I usually get up around 5 most days.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a really lovely framing. And this is what I find so refreshing about your work is that that is coming from a place of joy. You do it because you enjoy it. You don't feel obligated to do it. And perhaps, when I was doing that master's, I was doing it because I kind of had to do it. And I continued it for a bit afterwards, but eventually it did fall away because it clearly wasn't occupying that space for me in such a way. That said, I do have to do my planning every day. So I tend to do it more before I go to bed or at the end of the working day. And I don't think this is something that you can resolve, but I know that you've always talked about setting that up at the start of your day. Whereas, for example, Laura Vanderkam will talk about perhaps doing it the day before. Do you think this is just a personal choice, or do you think that there is any like specific advantages to doing it on the day? Because you must be influenced as well by somebody like her, who's always had the kind of plan on a Friday or plan the day before. So how have you weighed those sorts of things up for yourself?
Yeah, I think life's logistics and constraints, plus your natural nature, are going to kind of beat out any sort of ideological superiority of one day versus another. So I would say, like for me, I would love to plan on Friday. It sounds lovely. And there was a time that we used to have half a day of patients on Friday and then some fairly open ended administrative time in the afternoon. And I could do some of that. But those days have ended a couple years ago. I have a solid day of patients on Friday. So it's a clinical day for me. And when I get home from that day, I want to do nothing that requires any executive functions. Speaking of, that. So for me, that's not ideal. And so for my weekly planning, I prefer to do it on a Sunday just because that's what works for me. And my brain just seems to work better. People sometimes will sort of, and Laura actually has pointed out, and I think this is a good suggestion. Sometimes when you can't get other things done, something that's productive to do can be to plan. But I also think that if you're really, really tired, you're probably not gonna be able to plan either. Like, it does take a certain amount of
Yeah.
mental capacity and bandwidth to even do that planning, and for me, I can do it fairly efficiently in the morning, so it's not like it's sucking up my entire morning hours, but it's like 5-10 minutes very well spent.
Yes, fantastic. So we've talked about your morning, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to share some of your other signature planning concepts because I know you talk regularly about things like quintiles, the daily planning we've already touched on, but what would you love people to know about when it comes to the things that are like quite special to you? Probably they feature in the book as well.
Sure. I'll give you 3. The first one is actually a trifecta itself, and that's that I think that almost everyone can benefit from having 3 elements on lock. Number 1 is a calendar that is completely reliable, and that sounds so obvious, but not everybody has that. So you want to just make sure you have all of the time specific things that affect you in one system you can reference. I don't care what the system is. It can be Google Calendar, it can be Outlook, it can be, a dedicated app, it can be Skylight, it can be paper. It doesn't matter, but it has to be something that you trust and know that everything essential is on there, and it has to be updated on a regular enough basis so you know that's true. That's number 1. Number 2 is that you need some kind of really airtight task management system, meaning when you have things thrown at you or you think of things you need to do, you capture them somewhere. And not only do you have a full capture, but you know you're going to look at those places that you capture them every single day or enough that it's going to be reliable. Because it doesn't do any good to capture something in a notebook that you like may or may not look at. It's kind of like you have to close the loop by I capture everything in this app or paper tool or whatever. And I look at that paper tool every single day. So I know that I'm not going to not see the note I left for myself. So that's 2. And then the third is an effective goal setting system. ideally across different time horizons. The one I talk about a lot in my book and in general is called nested goals, which is the idea that you spend time planning out your year and really a good chunk of solid time doing that planning because a year is a pretty long time. And then you have that as a reference. And each season, you go back to that yearly list and you think about the season up ahead and you plan your season. Okay. And then each month, you look at that seasonal list and you plan your month. Each week, you do a much shorter session. You look at your monthly list and you plan your week. And then each day, you're looking at your weekly list. So, of course, a lot of the things that go on these lists are not all directly related to things that you put on your yearly list. Some are things that just came up. Like, if you're planning your week and the day before the teacher had said bring in cookies this day, like that wasn't on your yearly list, but it can still end up on your weekly list. But also, you're pulling things from the month which may have come from the levels above. So you're integrating both those kind of like in the moment I have to do them, but also, hey, I really identified that I wanted to do X, Y, and Z, and all of that comes together. So that would be like the third thing, like my nested goal setting system. Okay, so that is like a trifecta. And then other things I feel like are kind of I'm known for. Quintiles you mentioned, so I'll just talk about what those are. That is planning the year into 5 segments. This does not work for everyone and is not at all prescriptive, but if you do have school age kids, it can be a new lens in which to divide up the year that might make sense to you more than the traditional quarters. So I love to go from January 1st to spring break, from spring break to the summer, from summer to the beginning of school, and the beginning of school to November 1st, and then finally November 1st to the end of the year, which is like all the holidays and the celebration and the reflection. And that divides your year up into 5. And I love to do planning for each of those seasons. So I know you're not in the US, right? So those seasons may not be entirely applicable. Am I right?
Well, actually, I heard you talk about this many years ago, and initially it didn't quite make sense to me, but now I would say actually, especially as we now also have Halloween's a bigger thing for us. So you got literally the 31st of October. And then suddenly you look at November and they also have a midterm break or a half term break just at the end of November.
Ooh, so that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so then literally a term kicks off that is November and December. And so that final quintile is making so much more sense to me. Sort of almost each year that goes by, that's getting more embedded. So to me, it works really well, actually. I still like the seasons, the 4 seasons of the year. But what also I think is important is that you were just bold about picking what were those rhythms for you, and they
Correct.
happen to actually resonate for a lot of, I'm sure, people, especially in America, and that have the similar holiday cadence. And I think that's what's really cool. Like you stuck
Correct.
to
There's
that.
no
You
one
went with
right
quintiles.
way.
Yeah. But no one else was doing quintiles. So like to me that was quite unique at the time. And then it's just really pervaded clearly because it works. Right. Because it makes
Yes.
sense. Did you try out other options, or did it take you a while to stumble on it, or did it just sort of click?
I think one day it clicked and I didn't know, like, some people actually are like, "Oh, the quintiles planning person," and I'm like, "Wow, I never set out to be, like, defined by this random little one-off thing that I just thought was fun." But I do use it myself, and I think once I thought of it, I couldn't unsee it, I guess it would make sense, and then I ended up kind of designing a seasonal planning program around it, so now in my mind, I even have, like, different graphics and themes that kind of go with each of these seasons, so, yeah, I guess it just kinda clicked one day.
So in your book and in, I don't know, your seasonal, your planning tools, do you use the quintiles with others as well?
Yes, I
Yeah.
do. I use it myself, meaning like when
Yes.
I sit down to do a
Yeah.
seasonal session, I'm sitting down to plan summer, like or at the end of the May, because my kids are going to be out of school the first week of June. And again, the actual dates are going to vary. Like
Yeah.
even in the US, it's very regional. Like a lot of people start school up in the Northeast, like after Labor Day in September, but I'm in South Florida and in most of the South, it's a lot earlier. So like my quintile 4 starts beginning mid August and theirs might not start until like September.
Yeah. And then when you talk about the nested goals, and I also think of like Cal Newport, and he talks about multi-scale planning, right? And I do this fairly, I would say loosely. So I do have some annual goals, and I refer back to those maybe at the start of a quarter. It sounds very neat in theory, but I feel like it can get a bit messy or unravel. And now that you've maybe seen others do it alongside you, or you've run courses and things, have you seen that perhaps it can be messy or can fall over at certain points?
So one thing I think people sometimes will think is like, "Oh, you are, everything that's gonna go on your day-to-day list has to then be in your weekly list." Like, as if you could only pull from that nested piece and that's gonna inspire everything you're going to do. I absolutely don't think that's possible. Like, it sounds neat and nice, but life doesn't work like that, and we can't predict that much in advance. I mean, let's look at me. I had a major health event. I cannot run anymore because I have a heart condition I didn't know I had when 2025 dawned. Okay. So I had on my list for 2025, I was going to do my Boston qualifying marathon. I had some come so close the year prior and was like, this is it. And that was in my annual goals. And I had ideas about how to get there. But by the time I was doing my seasonal planning in season 2, like that goal was ridiculous. Like that, cross it off, it was not going to happen. So I think instead of seeing this as rigid, like, oh, again, I'm setting up all my things for the future, it's a set of ideas that you had when you gave a lot of time and thought to what you want in the future. And I mean, just realistically, we're not going to spend 2 days dreaming about our future like every week or every season, but maybe every year we can actually do that. And that's why those annual goals can really become very helpful reference points as you go to plan smaller and smaller segments. So I think people get tripped up when they think of this as like a completist thing or that it
Yeah.
stands alone. But instead, if it's a framework that like just helps guide you with the assumption that, not every one of these things is going to come true, but maybe some of these things do percolate all the way from these big pie in the sky ideas to daily tasks that actually come to fruition, then you can have a system that works for you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's again a really grounding and important thing to say when I know that my listeners are definitely those sort of high achievers that can sometimes imagine that then it has to be done in a sort of a perfect way or in a that really tight way. I certainly find that the quarterly reset is really helpful, and well, I might have had some headline themes or a word of the year and some big picture goals, but I certainly find that it's the quarter that is the time when I can really calibrate, recalibrate, and then set the tone. So I really like that type of thing. And actually, one thing I've taken from you is that you might book yourself a little mini planning retreat or half day or something like that. I've actually done a couple of those with my husband, so that's been really nice. I can't say that he had quite the stamina for it that I did, so so it was probably not the same length that I would have, but he found it really useful and some great things came out of it. And the things that came out of it were fun things, like realizing that our really nice window to have people over was actually Sunday afternoon tea rather than perhaps a dinner party or something. So that was actually a fun thing that came out from us doing it together. It was more like ideas based and social. So yeah, that was really nice.
I love that. I love doing a couple of the seasonal sessions with my husband. And you're right. Maybe we're not planning together the whole time, but we kind of make it part of a little time together, whether it's an extended date or like if we're really lucky and we get away for a weekend or something like that, we can spend some of that time planning, which is really, really fun.
Yes.
And you brought up a really important point, which is that and I think the cover and the vibe of my book and my stuff probably helps with this, but I think sometimes people think, "Oh my gosh, planning, strategic planning, boring, work, hard. I don't like planning because it's you're giving me homework." But like most of what I'm talking about planning is like building in the things of your into your life that you want to do, like fun things. So hopefully the planning itself doesn't feel like drudgery and it's certainly not about putting things on your plate that you didn't want to do in the first place.
Yes, and I think that's an important distinction and maybe moves us on to some of my other questions when I talk a little bit about kind of planning load and things like that. So actually what we've talked about is some of the more joyful elements, like you've talked about your morning ritual that you find very grounding to sort of do that piece of planning in fun parts, bringing the things that we want to build into the day. But we also know that there are those other elements of planning. You've got 3 kids, I've got 2 kids, and the kind of the complexity of that can sometimes just rear its head. There are certain times of the year where it's like you may or may not enjoy planning, but you've got to do a lot of it. And that stuff can become like a bit of a load. And I've always sort of wanted to ask your perspective on this. Do you feel like you carry that planning load for your family?
I do. I definitely carry that planning load for my family, both because I've chosen it and because I have a partner where it's just like not as much in his strength. However, I don't think the key lies in absolute equality in any given couple. I think the key lies in appreciation and cooperation. So, I talk in my book about something called planning privilege, which is when one party does all the planning, but the other one kind of poo-poos it or is like, "Why are you doing all that? God, I want to be spontaneous, etc." And I think that that can be problematic, but I think if one person acknowledges that the other person is doing this work, acknowledges it as work, like, "Thank you so much for figuring that out for us," and participates when asked, I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be equal as long as it is divided in an effective manner. And then hopefully, depending on the couple, and of course, this can go in either direction gender-wise, but you would hope that somebody else, whoever is not doing the bulk of the planning, is maybe pitching in some other type of a way. I know that is true in my household, and, I think it does make for a more equitable relationship.
Yeah. Okay. And okay, so I think you've answered some of my other questions around, does that feel invisible or unnoticed? Um, but I
I
guess
really encourage people where it does feel invisible to try to, in a very kind manner, to make it visible. Make sure they understand, well, it might not feel necessary, but if we don't book the trip in July, then we have a family of 5 and we're probably not going to have a lot of options. So, we can do it or we can wing it, but we would have to risk it. And once somebody understands like kind of the reasoning behind some of this kind of stuff and actually the mental capacity and the amount of time it takes, then often that can be helpful.
yeah. So I do actually think there's maybe another form of planner privilege as well, which is when your partner does understand. So I actually have friends where they have mentioned mental load to their partners, and that's actually been sort of dismissed. So that's really frustrating. So and these are people who really sort of like you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case. So I think it can be really challenging, and I do think there is a gendered element there. But I was just always curious because you certainly are the planner, but you have such a busy career, and so I wondered whether you ever did feel begrudged, that you were perhaps taking on more of that load and things like that. But it
I
sounds
feel
like
very lucky that my career explicitly talks about how much work I put into planning, and my partner is kind of forced to see that. So obviously that's not something that can be easily replicated in every relationship. But again, I think as best people can to show the labor that they're putting in, the better. And I mean, that is hard. And I think there are instances where this can get really bad and rough on
yeah.
relationships. And it's something that even like a third party might be necessary because I think that this is something that can rip couples apart in the kind of worst case scenario.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to mention it here because I feel sometimes that stuff is unsaid, but it's being carried by one person. So it's really interesting. It does remind me of something else that I have learned from you, which I think is really useful around planning weekends. And you've talked about how it doesn't need, or you used to talk about how it doesn't need to be equitable or 50-50, but as long as you get what you want from the weekend, whether that is like some time reading on the sofa or a nap or a run or a workout or whatever, then that actually it doesn't have to be carved up in a specifically percentage wise, and I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it, and planning enables that, right?
Yes, I think I learned that one from Laura. So I'll give her credit.
um okay, so shall we talk a bit about the book?
Sure.
Got a couple of questions here. So the first one is, where do you think this particular book fits? So I'm thinking about, you've got your Cal Newports, you've got your Laura Vanderkams, you've got your Kendra Adachi, who I think comes from a kind of a more feminine perspective, or she's really trying to go against that very masculine form of sort of productivity. And I just wondered, and you might have other influences and references, but I just wondered where you saw yourself fitting in with all of that
Yeah.
with your
Well,
book.
first of all, I love every single person you mentioned. I mean, Laura's my close friend. I've read every book Cal's written. I've been on his podcast. He's fantastic. And all of those have actually read my book and were kind enough to like endorse it. So it's lovely that you picked those people. I would say if my book relates to anything, it's a modern day Getting Things Done by David Allen, but brought into 2025 and told from a female perspective because I love Laura's writing and Cal's writing, but my book is more of a like, bundled up system. Like it's a little bit more of a how to. It doesn't get too like you must do all the pieces that I proposed to you, but it's less of a these are really interesting tips and stories and more of a like, here's how you could put a whole system together if you wanted to, kind of like Getting Things Done. And that's what I set out to write. And I really do think that that is what I ended up putting together. And I'm really, really proud of it.
I am so excited to read the book. And when I guess like, what made you write that book now? I know the opportunity sounds like the opportunity arose, but if you were to sort of pick a frustration or a problem or something that you saw, I don't know, more broadly, what do you think that you were trying to answer with the book or offer with?
Yeah, I think women, they are not giving themselves enough permission or enough time to spend planning. And I have started to equate it to a chef being like, I'm so overworked. I'm so busy. I don't have time to sharpen my knife. Okay. And like, this is the knife sharpening of life. And I did find that once I decided to put together a course called Best Laid Plans Academy. And once like I started seeing exactly what the struggles are and we talked about it, and I saw people make more time for these planning rituals and actually find benefit from that, I felt like that really, honestly, I'd wanted to write a book for a long time, but it wasn't until I actually kind of tested out teaching my methods to real people, saw what worked, saw what didn't, that I felt truly, truly ready to bring it out into the world. And then you're right. I ended up having an editor that approached me. I often find with really, really big goals, you need some kind of a fire lit. In my case, it ended up being external, but I guess, advice for anyone that wants to put together a big book or project, look for that accountability piece from somewhere else because, I mean, of course, it depends on your personality type, but for me, it really helped to have someone that A, believed in me, and B, gave me a deadline.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Just to respond on what you were saying about how talking about women and sharpening the knife, and actually this podcast is men and women, and I don't think there's anything in what you've said which isn't just as important for men as well.
Thank
And
you.
yeah. Yeah, and so I certainly think that this is something that could be better because I coach a lot of men, in fact probably coach more men than women, and I certainly haven't found that as we've then engaged in certain planning ideas and things that hasn't been hugely beneficial for them. And I would argue sometimes they might need it even more. So I certainly wouldn't, sort of limit this to just
100 I
women.
am so glad you said that, and I'm kicking myself for, like, limiting my audience in that way. The truth is that from a marketing perspective, people publishers, editors feel that on average, a book written by a woman is much from a woman's perspective, is much likely to have a female audience, but there is absolutely nothing in my book that is female specific, and I mean, yes, I have kids, but so do many men, and I work a full-time role. You know, I have a working partner, a working husband as well. But correct, there is nothing about planning that does need to be gendered, and I very much hope a lot of men will read my book. In fact, there is a vignette section in the back of the book, and I do have some male listeners. I think about 10% of my podcast listeners are male, and then I have had a few participants in my courses where I have one course where I let people attend as like a partner, like if they want to have their and I've had people where they go through as a couple, which was awesome. My planning by season course, and I made sure to include a vignette that was written by a male. And so yeah, there are I think 6 vignettes. Yes, there's 6 at the end, and they are not all women.
That's so cool. Yeah. I mean, I know that like one of your podcasts, Best of Both Worlds, is more, more focused on women. And I sometimes, I feel like, should I dilute, because I've got men and women listening to this podcast. And sometimes I think, should I make it for one or the other? Because it can make things simpler. But actually, I do think there is a category or where you can really speak to both. And to me, that also creates real change because I do think it's really important that couples can work together on this stuff. And that only creates more wonderful outcomes and makes it easier for everybody. So I will be putting this in the hand of my husband for sure. So and encouraging him to
Yes.
read this. Um, okay, so I think I've managed to ask all of my burning questions. And so now it's just a question of where can people find the book and where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, so the book is available. Well, I don't know internationally, but I know it's on, the US Amazon site. It's on Bookshop and Barnes and Noble and Target and all the places. And then you can request it, of course, at your local bookshop. I am on 2 podcasts. Best Laid Plans is my podcast that I do myself on all things planning and planning adjacent. And then Best of Both Worlds, I do with Laura Vanderkam. And that one is on making work and life fit together. I have a website that's like over 20 years old. It's like a legacy website, but I post on it almost every day. It's theshoebox.com, THESHU, which are my initials, BOX.com. You can find pre-order info there. Well, the book's out almost when this comes out. So
Yes.
book info there, podcast info, lots of other stuff. And you can subscribe to my newsletter there. That's about it. I'm not on
Yeah.
social media.
And so, if all has gone to plan, Sarah's book is coming out hopefully the day after this is airing. And I just want to plug for your blog because I love it. It is incredible. And I'm not somebody that reads blogs, but I really enjoy reading your blog. It's such a sort of soothing read. And Sarah, I think one of the ways that she is super efficient as well is that she's not on social media. So it's one way that I guess you do, you connect with the sort of like the written creative space apart from the podcast, and it's really
Yes.
cool. But yeah, like I'm curious to see how you managed to do all of this without social media as well, because I'm sure that in releasing the book as well, you might have been encouraged to share a little bit and things like that.
I'm very lucky. The team I've worked with has been very much like you do you. So, and again, thankfully I have the podcast and the newsletter and my website. So I think they're cool. I don't plan on I just can't. I don't love the mediums to consume, and I definitely don't love them to create. So, yeah, I'll just stay in my wonderful RSS feed driven world.
Yes, and I do think that is one of your secrets, though, as well. Just like I remember speaking to Laura, and she doesn't watch TV, and I do think sometimes you need these secrets, like the things that just become the biggest drains. To not have them is one of the ways that you manage to do everything that you do. So, Sarah, it has been so nice to have this whistle stop conversation with you on all of the things that I've always been meaning to ask you, but also wanted the listeners to be able to hear about. So, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk. I know it's a very busy time for you.
Oh my gosh, Maya, thank you so much for having me on.
It's been a delight. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you next time. Bye bye.